Hello and welcome. You're watching CNN News 18. It's about a month since the invasion in Ukraine started from today. Obviously, Russia's huge land invasion, but an emergency NATO summit that took place yesterday seems to have functioned as a catalyst for the West to further strengthen their ties. Now, a series of high-level meetings took place. This is with EU leaders and the G7 also, followed by an emergency NATO summit that took place in Brussels. Now, in his address to that NATO summit, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, he reiterated his demand for more arms from the alliance. In return, NATO has guaranteed Ukraine's protection against chemical, biological weapons, and obviously nuclear threats. They've also pledged extensive humanitarian support to host refugees. Now, on the economic front, the United States and its allies have imposed fresh sanctions on Russia. They've targeted dozens of Russian defense companies and individuals. CNN's Nic Robertson is live with us right now from Brussels. Hi, Nic. Good morning. To your mind, what are the key takeaways right now from the NATO summit as it took place yesterday in Brussels?
Well, I think the key takeaway is unity, and that's what President Biden came for. He came to present, or rather galvanize everyone to take a long-term view of the current situation. Of course, everything that's happened to now, everything that NATO has done, moving troops around, bolstering the troops on the eastern flank, on NATO's eastern flank, has been done after the immediate steps of the war and right leading up to it. Now it's a case of making sure that position is united and solidifying it going forward. And that's what I think one of the takeaways was. And we heard that as well in the statement. NATO saying that Russia should stop the war and pull its troops out of Ukraine. So that was one piece. I think the other takeaway, and if you're being very pragmatic, it has to be that there was nothing new that was announced in terms of sort of concrete NATO action. We didn't get new numbers and new troop deployments. Those details are going to come later in the year, expected at a NATO Leaders Summit in June. So I think those are the two takeaways: the unity, but maintaining this position, and not sort of moving onto another newer position, if you will.
Nic, if I can ask you, going into this summit, there were a lot of questions over what possible contingency plans would look like if NATO countries were drawn in, due to misfire, due to any other incidents. Do we know if there were any contours for those contingency plans chalked out at all?
No, not in detail. And that was something that both President Biden and the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg didn't want to get into. They did say that if Russia did perpetrate a chemical weapons attack, and dependent on what that chemical weapons attack looked like and how much it affected NATO nations, then there would be a response. We do know that in the United States, at least, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been briefing about meetings that have been going on for the past month or more now, sometimes several times a week, between US officials to look at what they would do, how they would respond, what exactly they would do if Russia was to use, for example, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, or stray into NATO territory. So we know there are plans. We know that that's being worked out behind the scenes, but the details are not being made public at the moment.
All right, Nic, and one more question here. I think our audiences might already know that the Ukrainian president addressed the summit yesterday. Tell us a little bit more about the takeaways from his address, but tell me also about, that NATO response to the address. Is there at all a sense right now that this exchange between the two of them, between the Ukrainian president and the NATO summit, it's sort of falling on deaf ears?
No, I think it's President Zelensky is tailoring his speeches for the audience. He didn't ask for a no-fly zone. He didn't make a pitch that he knew already that wouldn't be acceptable to NATO. But he did reiterate that he does need more surface-to-air missiles, that he does need more complex air defense systems, that he does need these Javelin anti-tank missiles. And his pitch there was for quite significant numbers of those to be supplied. And on the contrary side, you have other European leaders such as Emmanuel Macron and others saying, look, there is a threshold. We cannot be perceived as putting too many weapons into Ukraine, because then we become co-belligerents. And that's part of the NATO message as well, not to ramp up the fight with weapons or a NATO involvement in such a way to draw NATO in and therefore make the conflict bigger, and therefore put, you know, the 500 million people within NATO nations, way more than that actually, close to 1 billion people within NATO nations, essentially potentially in the line of fire. So there is a balance, and President Zelensky didn't ask for what he knew he couldn't have, but pushed for what was on the outer limit of what he might be able to get.
All right, and Nic, my last question for you. With President Biden now headed into Poland, can you tell us a little bit more about what our audiences should look forward to there? Could you also tell me, when it comes to each of these meetings in the last few days, does the United States feel as if its objectives have been met?
I think so far the objective's been met. If you look at every statement, the one from NATO, the one from the G7, the joint White House European Council leaders statement as well, they're in lockstep. Multiple points, all saying to Russia, stop the war, you're going to be investigated for potential war crimes, pull your troops out, and also a message for Belarus as well, not to raise the tensions, not to get further involved than they are, and a message for China as well, that it must or should not give military or political support to Russia at this stage. So that's on that side. That's the achievements here for President Biden, and galvanizing this unity again and driving the view forward that this position must be maintained going forward. What to expect in Poland? Expect President Biden to meet with President Duda of Poland. Expect him to visit a site where we can expect refugees to be, those who have just been forced out of Ukraine. And expect him as well to visit with the 82nd Airborne, who, of course, are troops that were sent from the United States about a month and a half, 2 months ago, to be on that eastern flank of NATO in Poland, to help give Poland the confidence that NATO nations stand behind them, the United States stands behind them, and there's a deterrent buffer there against whatever Russia may do across the border in Ukraine. So I think those are the key things to look for: seeing the troops, political messaging with the Polish president, support being given to Poland and the Polish people, and, of course, a message for the Ukrainians that we are here to support and help. And, of course, President Biden committing $1 billion for humanitarian assistance, and saying that the United States would take 100,000 Ukrainian refugees into the United States. So that's what we should look for on Friday in Poland.
Nic Robertson, thank you so much for joining us. That's Nic Robertson, CNN, live right now from Brussels.